stitching on the Baby Lock Zest is one of those fun techniques. It's just rows and rows of the straight stitch. So the first thing we're going to do is make sure that we're still on stitch A and we have a stitch length of 2.5. Now what I've done is I've actually attached the walking foot, and to do that I removed the standard presser foot along with the ankle, and when attaching that walking foot, make sure that you get the claw or the hook on that foot tight up against that presser foot bar, and then you also have the little arm around the needle tightening screws. So I've marked my fabric and I'm going to sew on my first row, and again it's just a straight stitch, and we're going to go ahead and sew along that marked line. Now after we've sewed that first stitch, what we're going to do is we're going to attach a little guide that helps us adjust the next row of stitching. And in this case, I'm using it with 3 layers of fabric. I am, in a sense, creating my quilt. I have my backing, my batting, and my top layer. So I'm coming to the end, and I'm going to go ahead and take that needle out of the fabric. I'm going to raise the presser foot, and I'm going to cut the thread. Now, rather than marking my whole piece of fabric as I marked this first line here, I actually want to use a device called a quilt guide. And where this foot fits in is on the back of this presser foot. There's a tiny little hole, and we're just going to go ahead and slide it into that hole. And to adjust the depth or the distance between our next row of stitching, we're going to go from the needle to our quilt guide. And let's say I'm going to put that at about 1/2 inch there. And I'm going to go ahead now for the next row of stitching, instead of lining up my needle with the marked line, I'm going to line up the quilt guide with my last row of stitching. So here I'm going to go ahead and create that second row of stitching. Again, always making sure that that quilt guide sits on that first row of stitching or that last row of stitching. We're going to go ahead and we're going to stitch to the end. Needle out of the fabric, and there's our second row of stitching. To add the third row, again we're going to place our fabric underneath. So I'm going to line up the quilt guide with that last row of stitching, and I'm going to continue to stitch all the way down to the end, making sure that that quilt guide again rides along or on top of the last row of stitching that I completed. Come to the end, and then we're going to go ahead and clip our threads. Now another way to use the same technique is, in this case I was adding to a quilt. I'm embellishing my quilt and I wanted that walking foot so my layers didn't shift. But for instance, if I were just wanting to embellish a piece of fabric in the same manner where I had lots of rows of straight stitches, I would use the standard presser foot. And on the back side of the ankle that the presser foot connects to, you'll notice that there's a tiny little hole for this quilt guide to slide into. So all that I would do is simply slide that quilt guide into it, position it where I needed it positioned, and then I would go ahead and stitch in the same manner. So you see, it's real easy to add a lot of embellishment or a lot of texture with simple rows of straight stitching, whether it's on a quilt using the walking foot or whether it's on a piece of fabric using the standard presser foot and a quilt guide. It's all really just simple and easy using the Baby Lock Zest.